So calories in versus calories out. A question that comes up constantly. Does it truly matter, and is it a real thing? All over the internet right now, we see people that are talking about just if it fits your macros or eating whatever you possibly want as long as it fits within a specific caloric range. And then we have another subset of people that talk about the ketogenic diet and say that when you're on a keto diet, calories don't matter at all, or when you're fat adapted, calories don't matter at all. So what we want to do is we want to break this down. And in order to break this down, I brought in someone that I highly, highly respect in the YouTube space. This is Mr. Mike Mutzel. And Mike, I appreciate you coming here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
Totally. And tell everyone kind of, a little bit about you and why they should be listening to what we're talking about today.
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. So I have a master's degree in human nutrition, undergraduate degree in biology, and I've been studying this stuff for a long time like you. We have similar backgrounds. So I used to work with medical doctors, integrative doctors, and so I've worked with a lot of healthcare practitioners, studied the research, and I too am a skeptic initially, right, of all these different things. I was even a skeptic at first of keto, and so I like to go into the research and see what's going on, what scientists are saying, and what they're publishing. So one of my passions, like you, is looking at metabolic science and figuring out ways that we can optimize our body's physiology. So that's what I focus on my channel.
Awesome, very cool. And for those of you that know my background, some of you may or may not, but when he said we have similar backgrounds, we both came from sort of this medical background in the sense that we're not doctors, but we work closely with physicians. Like I managed over 1,200 physicians in the world of like ancillary lab services, providing lab services to them. You worked in the industry and worked very closely with pharma and everything. So we just know the good, the bad, and the ugly of the industry. Sure. And it's like, you don't have to be a doctor to know the industry. In fact, I could also argue that a lot of times the doctors don't know the industry as much as the people that are working a little bit more on the admin side.
Totally. Which is scary to think about, right?
It really is scary. Yeah. And it's probably why you got into what you're doing and why I got into what I'm doing.
Exactly. No, that's how I started. Yeah, I was doing webinars for doctors, teaching them about nutrition. It's funny, and so that's how I started this whole YouTube channel and everything. So yeah, it's interesting.
No, that's awesome. And I want to say, it goes without saying, like, of course, watch this video, but you guys have to go check out Mike's channel because he is completely undervalued on YouTube. I think you deserve way more subs than you have because and you're growing fast, but your channel is phenomenal. But anyway, without further ado, let's get to the subject matter. Okay, so calories in, calories out. You and I kind of come from the same cut of cloth when it comes down to this, but the common thing that I've been getting hit with lately is you're having these guys come out and say that, especially with the advent of the keto diet, that calories are the end-all be-all. Like, it's all going to come down to calories. Is a calorie really a calorie? And is calories in going to be calories out? So I first want to hear kind of your initial stance on this, and we can get kind of a discussion going on.
Sure. No, that's great. I mean, it's really interesting to think about because, if we think about like when we go to the gym and say we burn 3,500 calories, right? Let's say you and I were in beautiful, Southern California, we go for a bike ride. Yeah. I used to race bicycles and, several times when I was training on the weekend for 6 hours, I would burn north of 6,000 calories. So theoretically, I should have lost over about 2 pounds, just under 2 pounds of fat per day doing that. But sometimes I would actually gain weight, right? So I think it's oversimplified. The human metabolism is so integrated with nutrient sensing receptors, hormones, and so we really need to think about all the different networks and so forth on the cellular and biological level. And so I think it's just been oversimplified. If we think about what a calorie is, it's a unit of energy to break down, it's a unit of heat, to break down a finite amount of energy. The body doesn't necessarily work like that. Like, that's a concept in physics. Yeah. And so I think it's just, calories certainly matter. Like, I don't think you can overconsume a lot of calories, right? More than your physical activity would garner. And necessarily lose weight, but I think with the hormonal shifts and the nutrient sensing receptors that are upregulated with fasting, with keto, with exercise, we have a lot of wiggle room there. Yeah. And so you and I both know when we see comments of clients that have been following a low calorie diet for a long period of time and their body composition, it stagnates, right? So the body is constantly adapting. So I think it's important for people, just big canvas overview, calories do matter, but hormones, nutrient sensing receptors, all these other factors in your lifestyle really govern how your body utilizes and partitions energy.
Precisely, and it's like we hear about the basal metabolic rate, right? Or just our basic amount of calories we burn in a day. And I love bringing this up with people because the thing is the basal metabolic rate, like, it's fluctuating by the second. That's the thing. It's like we can't really even average that out to a day, because it's going to change so much. So all these different hormonal fluctuations, everything that plays a role in our calories in, calories out directly affects what our basal metabolic rate is at that very point in time. And one of the things that I often talk about is looking at your caloric needs at a different scale rather than a day, because a day is that's just a moment in time. That's just a day. Like, look at it over the course of a week, because it might give you a little bit more of a macro picture of the different fluctuations you're going to have based on hormones and whatnot. And you talk about, different reception we have to different things. And one of the things that I recently discovered is how the inflammation pathway works with a fat cell specifically. And a fat cell produces its own kind of anti-inflammatory components and inflammatory components. And when one is obese or a fat cell is engorged, it's producing more of the inflammatory component. It has sort of a, for lack of a better term, almost a positive feedback system. So it sees that and it actually grows more, which therefore would mean that your calorie is not equal anymore, because now that calorie is being directed more towards a fat cell and triggering more inflammation within that fat cell. Does that make sense?
Totally, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So inflammation changes nutrient partitioning and how nutrients are distributed throughout the body. So if you and I were to treat someone that had, say, a 3rd-degree burn, their resting metabolic rate would say they're burning 1,600 calories per day. They have a burn, their resting metabolic rate is going to increase, and they're going to need more, say, sugar and so forth. Their fat cells are going to hold on to energy and all that. So that it's really interesting that you bring that up, because there's so many different aspects of our physiology: inflammation, how long you've been overweight, how enlarged your fat cells are, autoimmunity, all these things totally pivot your metabolic rate. And so a great point. And then to that, kind of second to that, a lot of people think that they're overweight, they have a sluggish metabolic rate. They think, well, I just have a slow metabolism. But if you look at the overweight people, they actually, their resting metabolic rate is generally higher than someone that's of less weight. So if you want to raise your resting metabolic rate, if you think that's the end all be all, you can gain weight and overeat. And so that will cause your body to, likewise, if you want to slow things down, if you just chronically restrict your calories. And so that slows things down. But
no, exactly. And it kind of comes back to, like when we talk about like the ketogenic diet, it's got some amazing abilities to help you preserve your mass, your muscle mass, which is your biggest driver for your metabolic rate. So, when we do give a little bit of credit to those that preach the calories in, calories out, I mean, that's where we can actually throw a bone to them, right? It's like, okay, great. Well, if we do look at that theory, then the ketogenic diet actually lends itself quite well to that. And I'm not saying that just because I'm a proponent of the keto diet. It's just, it all comes down to it just brings your point. Like, usually someone that is carrying a large amount of weight, whether it's fat or muscle, if they're carrying a large amount of fat, there's usually a good amount of muscle to carry that weight. And the muscles are under a pretty significant load to carry that weight. So there's a higher degree of metabolic activity just occurring there. So when you look at something like the keto diet, it actually preserves lean body mass. So I think there's a couple of studies, but I know one, I can't reference exactly where it is, but the study basically found that when they went on a massive calorie restriction, they basically maintained most of their resting metabolic rate even after losing 40 pounds in a pretty quick amount of time. So it's going to show that we can lose our weight and still keep our metabolism nice and high, even in somewhat of a calorie deficit, if we have the right nutrients in place. And the reason I mention that is simply because that calorie coming from fat in a ketogenic state is clearly not the same as a calorie coming in that's not fat in a non-ketogenic state.
Totally. Well, and I think the metabolic signature is different, right? So if you compare two people, one's in ketosis, one is not, and they're under eating calories, for example, you put them in a deficit, so to speak, which we can define shortly and talk about if that really does happen. But there is a different nutrient, the whole metabolome and proteome. You've probably talked about this on the channel, but different genes are being turned on and turned off based upon what nutrients are in the system. And what's so unique about ketones is they affect not only our genetic expression, but the epigenome. So the above the genome control, and this higher order control of different metabolic pathways, nutrient pathways. And so, it's really interesting. Some of the studies that have underfed individuals, so kind of restricted their calories, and given them a ketogenic diet, they preserve more lean mass, and they don't have the weight loss induced, it's a big word, weight loss induced suppression of their resting metabolic rate.
Exactly.
So if you and I both go on a diet, we lose 20 pounds. Our thyroid hormone, our adrenaline, the hormones that comprise our metabolism is going to slow down. Absolutely. But if we do that on a ketogenic diet, that metabolic slowdown that's linked with weight loss is going to be attenuated a little bit. So that's what's cool. So you don't see that, and that's why I think personally, and this is just Mike talking without any major human clinical studies to show this, I think that's why the ketogenic diet is so successful, because people are not having that chronic suppression in their metabolic rate. And so they're losing weight and they're maintaining the weight loss, which is what we're trying to get people to do.
Exactly. And I agree with you entirely, and it adds to the point of talking about insulin a little bit. And I think that it's more so the reasons that we just discussed that the ketogenic diet is great for weight loss and has been so successful, and it's less to do with the chronically low levels of insulin. I do believe that insulin plays a big role, for sure, but there's a lot of
other hormones.
Yeah, there's a lot of other hormones, but there's just a lot of evidence going both ways with insulin. So, some people will say that insulin by far absolutely plays no part in weight loss. We talked about some studies there. The fact is that suppressed levels of insulin do have some other hormonal responses that cause us to burn more fat, but I think the biggest driver with like a low carb ketogenic diet is not the elimination or the decrease in insulin. It's more so the presence of the ketones and what they actually do to gene expression and what they actually do to our body and our ability to metabolize.
That's such a great point. Yeah, and I mean, and so the calorie counting crowd kind of makes fun of ketogenic people and saying, they use words like the insulin fairy and say, all you ketogenic people, you focus on insulin, but a prerequisite to get into ketosis is, I know you've talked about it on the channel, low glucose, low insulin, but high glucagon. So we do kind of forget about that. So there's all these other hormones, and insulin is a big one. But some of the controlled metabolic ward studies have found by Kevin Hall and other folks, and they're proponents of the continuous energy restriction model of obesity. Like, obesity is really a function of how much energy you're burning versus how much you're ingesting, right?
Yeah.
That's their premise. And what we're kind of talking about is this other model where there's hormones involved, nutrient sensing receptors, maybe genes, networks and so forth. And they actually, in some of those models, they show that insulin doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But in the tissue culture studies, what we see is if I were to give you insulin right now and look at your fat cells under a microscope, your fat cells are going to hold on to more fat. They're not going to release it. That's called adipocyte lipolysis.
Yep,
and
exactly.
we need that lipolysis to eventually burn the fat for fuel. And so that's where I think a lot of people, they see one study, they see it's all insulin because, if you give insulin to an animal, they don't release as much. Now, but there's all these other hormones. There's leptin, ghrelin, adiponectin, glucagon. I mean, there's a lot of these different things. And what we see with a low carb diet, particularly if people have insulin issues, is it tends to normalize this whole network of hormones. And so that's what's exciting. And I think it dovetails to what you were saying is, instead of look at insulin or look at your calories in one day, look at this over the long haul, right? And so like I do that too, like I calorie cycle, like some days I fast, Monday I fast, today I'm fasting, but tomorrow I'll have dinner with my family, I'll have a surplus, right? And so I think getting people to think bigger about this can help them.
Yeah, and it's like, this is a point that those who've watched my channel are probably gonna say, Tom, you sound like a broken record because you talk about this all the time, but you bring up such like a solid point in that if I am, like right now, we're not consuming anything. Does that technically mean we're in a deficit? Yes, okay. Well, if you were to consume like one M&M right now, or I were to consume one M&M, would that mean that we're technically not in a deficit anymore? It's like, how do you, because at that very point in time, at this very moment in time, I'm in a deficit, but the second that I eat that M&M, I'm not in a deficit anymore. Technically, I'm in a surplus for even a nanosecond, right? Mm-hmm. So if calories in, calories out is the end all be all, then we definitely have to look at it at different scales, because I could go home today and say, well, I was in a calorie surplus today for like a nanosecond. But did I gain fat in that nanosecond? No. I'm pretty sure I didn't. So are we constantly in a tit for tat? Like the second I eat something, I'm gaining fat, and the second I'm not, I'm burning it? No, that's not what's happening. So it's just the body has the flexibility. And when we go on any kind of lower carb or even just low calorie diets, and this kind of poses another question, is like, is the slowdown of your metabolism a bad thing? First off, I want to put it out there that like when we look at like our ancestors, like a slower metabolism isn't always a bad thing. I see that as, that's metabolic flexibility. That's actually, if you have two people that are in a situation where one requires a lot of calories and one does not, in a survival situation, the person that has a slower metabolism might actually end up faring better. Mm-hmm. So that's not always the end of the world, but the fact is that it just doesn't come down to that almighty calorie at every single second. It's just a unit of heat. That's all it is.
Right. Excellent point. And a few kind of follow-up things on that. So if we didn't have a suppression or a mild transient decrease in our resting metabolic rate associated with fasting or when food was gone, we would actually strip away muscle mass. Yep. So it's hypothesized. George Cahill, you probably reviewed some of his research on this channel. Oliver Owen, who was part of that group, and then he went on to do some other fasting studies. So they find that thyroid hormone, because this comes up a lot, like if I do keto or I fast, and I think you did a video on it, like these ketones are going to gobble up your thyroid. I think it's what you use, the word, right? And so this has been a passion project of mine because I get so much kickback on Instagram, like I tried keto, but it wrecked my thyroid. So here's the thing, so if we fast for 3 days, our free T3, free T4, and reverse T3, our T3 levels are going to go down. So effectively, our thyroid function is going to decrease and our reverse T3 will increase. Yeah. But like you're saying, is that always a bad thing? And if part of the mechanisms associated with that is to preserve lean muscle mass, because what T3 does in the body is it can actually basically break down muscle protein called proteolysis, muscle proteolysis, splitting out. So if we didn't have that kind of suppression in our thyroid hormone, we might lose lean muscle mass. And you and I both know, and people probably listening know, most of our resting metabolic rate is governed by muscle. So you're like, if you didn't have the body's smart. It's been doing this for many, many years and generations, guys. So first thing there, like, don't be totally surprised by small changes in hormones. They're transient. We're not saying fast every day. We're saying like 1 day a week or 2 days a week, or do a 5-day fast once a quarter. You know, everyone has their different approach. And so, again, looking at the big picture, I think that's important.
No, you nailed it. And I just want to add to the thyroid thing, just in case people didn't see that video or haven't seen any of your content, but like glucose metabolism in general requires thyroid. So when glucose is lower, because you're on like a keto diet or you have less of that, there's less thyroid that's actually being allocated for that. So therefore your thyroid hormone is going to decrease, but it doesn't mean your metabolism necessarily even slowed down. It just means there's less that's actually being required at that point in time. So it's the same kind of thing. It's like, when do you look at it? You know, when does it really matter? And which is a great lead into something we talked about before we started filming this, which was the gluconeogenesis pathway. And this is, and I have to fall on the sword, because there was a couple of years ago, like, I was with a lot of the other people that I thought that gluconeogenesis could damage the ketogenic diet, like creating excess blood sugar that could cause a rise in insulin that kicks you out of keto. But there is some truth to that to some degree, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. But gluconeogenesis is basically the process where your body's taking other energy substrates, muscle, for example, and breaking it down into glucose. Well, what's interesting is that to create energy from protein, you end up at an actual net loss of energy. So for example, like glycolysis, when you're using glucose to make energy, 1 gram of glucose ends up yielding 2 ATP. Okay, so it gives you, a little bit of energy, right? But then when you look at the gluconeogenesis pathway, it takes 6 units of ATP to actually process and create that 1 unit of glucose. So you're at a net loss of 4 ATP. So you're actually, in an effort for your body struggling to create some energy, it's like basically jumping over dollars to save nickels, but it does it. And it's inefficient, but inefficient to a degree that if you have ketones present at the same time, you could have the muscle sparing effects of the ketones while actually creating sort of a manufactured deficit through that gluconeogenesis pathway. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think that's such a good, I didn't know that 4 molecules of ATP to make the glucose. Yeah, so it's an expensive way to make energy, but because we're in a state of ketosis or we're fasting, while we need these, gluconeogenesis happens when we're not getting exogenous or foreign glucose coming in. So it's obviously a positive thing. And what a lot of people don't understand about gluconeogenesis, and you alluded to it, is ketosis and gluconeogenesis are parallel pathways. Because it would be amazing if every cell in the body could utilize ketones, but I know you've covered this on the channel. Not every tissue or cell type in our body, the red blood cells, the retina, different neurons in the brain need, they're what I call obligate, meaning they have to utilize glucose. So it needs to come from somewhere. And in the first 24 hours of fasting, it comes from stored glycogen in our muscle tissue and in our liver. After that, it's coming from one of kind of 3 sources: lactate recycling, right? So lactic acid from utilizing glucose, or glycerol, which is the backbone of your stored triglycerides or fat. So the free fatty acids from that triacylglyceride or triglyceride, those go on to make ketones and can be utilized to make energy through beta oxidation. Or that glycerol backbone, of course, as you know, can be utilized to make glucose, which is really cool. So it's like stored body fat can go both ways. And that's why, again, people shouldn't be scared of gluconeogenesis if they're in ketosis. I think that would be bad if you're, you wouldn't want gluconeogenesis happening on a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet, right? Because then you would just add fuel to the fire. So I think that's really interesting to kind of talk about that. So, but what's interesting about ketones too is they also work on the adipocyte level. So Ben Bickman has talked about this, and they actually make fat cells more inefficient in creating energy, and they liberate more heat. And so this is called mitochondrial uncoupling. We hear about this in brown adipose tissue or brown fat. So I know you talked about cold thermogenesis, ice baths, things like that. Even exercise stimulates this brown fat. And what's unique about brown fat is instead of making the ATP that you just alluded to, it makes heat essentially, and it kind of uncouples the mitochondria. And Ben Bickman over at BYU, what he's shown is that in fat tissue, ketones make the adipocytes more inefficient. So they're creating more heat, which is really unique. So again, it goes back to this calorie in, calorie out model where the body has all these different mechanisms to dissipate energy that are not always creating energy to do work, like they're doing other things like you're referring to
That's
metabolically.
So this increase in, and this is, because you might know the answer to this, and just on this kind of question. So in an effort, like with this rise in uncoupling protein and everything that allows this to occur, in your hypothesis, would this is that probably why we feel cold, and because it's pulling from the extremities and going there to release heat to protect our vital organs? And I'm just connecting the dots. Totally. It's a little bit of a digression, but I'm just kind of thinking.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. So I was actually talking with Peter Attia about this, and I think it depends on how much lean body mass you have and your body fat percentage.
Yeah.
So what I found is, especially in women who are like really low body fat, for women like 15%, after they fast, they get cold.
Yeah.
For me, I'm sure you're sitting pretty lean, what, 12%, 11%, even lower?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Somewhere like that. So not a lot of body fat, right? So I think for someone like yourself, the preservation of lean mass is going to prioritize, and so your thyroid hormone is going to decrease quickly to preserve that mass, to get gluconeogenesis coming from the adipocytes. Yeah. So that's my hypothesis, and because I don't see people with a high body fat percentage complain of being cold when they fast or do keto. Yeah. It's mostly people that are of low body fat, but I would love to I'll follow the comments and see what people say.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, make sure you guys comment below and let us know, because I mean, I've definitely seen some comments, but I don't know. And just use your own judgment. I mean, if you feel like you're lean, and you get cold, then that would be worth noting, because I mean, I definitely get cold when I fast. Me too. Yeah. And I know we're kind of bridging the gap a little bit here, but like, I don't want people to get concerned that they're getting cold because their metabolism's slowing down. That's not really what's going on. That's what people think, oh, my metabolism must be screeching to a halt. If anything, if you're feeling that, I mean, you have this increase in uncoupling protein that's allowing this heat dissipation to occur. So you're actually, in essence, creating more heat, but you're just feeling cold more than likely in your extremities. You're probably not feeling cold at your core. It's probably your hands, your feet, your arms, your legs getting a little bit cold. Absolutely.
It's a great point. Just to re-emphasize, the difference between intermittent energy restriction, what we call intermittent fasting. So this is what scientists they use more complex jargon, in research papers, right? Comparing that to continuous energy restriction. So studies have looked at the outcome versus like periodic, calorie surplus and then calorie deficits versus continuous energy deficits. That does suppress your resting metabolic rate for a long period of time. And there's differences in lean body mass, how much lean body mass is preserved. And I think there's 7 pretty well conducted human clinical trials now that have compared intermittent fasting versus chronic energy restriction. And 6 out of the 7 have shown that when you do intermittent fasting or periodic energy restriction, you actually burn more body fat, you lower your triglycerides more, you increase HDL, lower LDL. So these are all metabolic parameters that are linked with insulin resistance, the metabolic syndrome, and you preserve lean more muscle. Yeah, I said that. You preserve more lean muscle mass. And what's unique is these studies is when they look at the subjects after, like let's say you put individuals, I think one group in Colorado, what they did is they had a 12-week, 2 arms of the study, low calorie versus intermittent fasting. They followed up 20 weeks later to see, okay, well, what happens long term? The individuals actually on the intermittent fasting style diet had less fat regain, had preserved more lean muscle mass, and in terms of their metabolic parameters, they were still better than the group that was in the continuous energy deficit. Wow. So that shows to me that, okay, we can argue all day long calories in, calories out, but long term in real humans, not short-term 10-day studies in a metabolic ward.
Yeah, exactly.
There is a physiologic difference. And so I think that's the thing to kind of think about, because a lot of the people that are proponents of the energy in versus energy out as the sine qua non of weight loss, they're not looking at the long-term human clinical studies. Yeah. And David Ludwig's group has done this too. And so they actually had people lose weight up to, I think they lost 5% of their body weight. Mm-hmm. So, and then they randomized people to low carb, medium carb, and high carb diets, and they found there was definitely a difference in leptin, in ghrelin, in body weight regain, exactly. All these parameters. So it's like we're seeing that the nutrients that you eat and how you go about your fasting protocols changes your body composition in different ways.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. It's definitely, it's interesting to see just as a whole, all these different pieces that come together. And I think that's kind of the general consensus of what we're saying today is that calories do matter, but they're going to matter at different periods and they're going to matter at different levels. And there's a lot more to it than just a simple calories in, calories out. And I want to kind of wrap this up on this simple note.
Sure.
We have to look at the longevity piece too. And you talked about gene expression, you talked about thyroid. There's been studies that show that a lower level of thyroid is actually better for longevity. So I want everyone to look at the big picture. We all want to look good, we all want to feel good, we all want to be lean and mean, but the reality is we also want to live for a long time. And that's when we have to look at calories in, calories out, and save this topic for another day, but the quality of those calories, despite what anybody says, do matter. And it matters when it comes down to your gene expression, when it comes down to living for a long time, and just living an ultimately healthy life.
That's such a great point. Yeah, and so I think we can achieve this calorie reduction that's associated with longevity and vitality through intermittent fasting as opposed to chronically restricting them.
Exactly.
And so that's what I advise people to do. Plus, that makes life more enjoyable, right? So if you know that you're going to have friends over, do brunch, have your family and all that, you don't want to be like worrying about calories.
Exactly.
You can have a surplus on that day and then maybe fast the next day, for example. And so create a healthy relationship for food. Because I do see people make this mistake where they're like, I overate, so I'm just going to fast. And that's like disordered eating behaviors, right? So like have a little structure, and I encourage people just do one 24-hour fast every week. If you look long term, if you do that every week for 1 year, you're about 17% in a quote unquote calorie restricted state for your entire year. And that gets you to about that 20% number that researchers look at that's associated with reduced cancer, reduced autoimmunity, preservation of brain health and all that in animals. So exciting stuff for sure.
No, it's really exciting stuff. And if you guys want to see more on this and you want to see more collaboration with Mike, please put it down in the comment section, because again, it's not very often that we get someone on the channel that we can actually riff on this stuff, because it's people are usually very biased in their approaches. And one thing I appreciate about you is that you're pretty open, pretty honest, and you use tools in your toolkit, and I try to do the same. So Mike, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
My pleasure.
Guys, make sure you give him a follow. Honestly, he's going to drop some knowledge bombs that even make my mind just go. So
thanks guys. Thanks for having me on.
See you soon.